Okay, so this will be a radically different talk from what you're expecting, because this will be looking at Angular from a totally different perspective, as in how the hell do I build this thing and how the hell do I ship it and deploy it. My name is Maciej Misztal. I work for the sponsor, and amongst other things, here are some technologies that I work with on a daily basis or I'm pretty passionate about. Also, my wife considers me to be an addict, although I claim it is not true. So, this talk is going to be primarily about Azure, and before we start getting into the deep technicals, I thought it would be worth a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So how did this thing come to happen? So, typically when Microsoft starts working on a new project, they assign an internal code name for the project, not to reveal it to the public. And in October 2008, Project Red Dog was announced, and not so long after, Windows Azure has been released. But this was only available in a couple of locations, like 2 or 3 locations in the US, 2 locations in Europe, and maybe 1 location in Australia, if my memory serves me right. And there was only a very basic service set available. So those were so-called cloud services. And the deal was that you could run an instance on your application on top of a full virtual machine. So when you wanted to scale this out, in that way you would spawn additional virtual machines, and Microsoft would then put a vacuum cleaner into your wallet and start sucking in money. And that wasn't very cost effective, so that they have realized that. And a few years later, they have completely changed the platform as a service model. So in June 2012, there was the first modern platform as a service offering called Azure Websites. And they revamped Azure Portal, and a complete change in how Azure resources are being managed. And what happened to the screen? All right. So ever since then, we have been having a new portal. The previous management application was actually written in Silverlight. And in 2012, with the rise of HTML5, the Silverlight application has died. And in 2014, the portal was rewritten again, this time under a new resource management model called the Azure Resource Management Manager, ARM for short. So what is Azure? It's actually pretty easy to explain, because internally Microsoft has this microservice scheduling platform called Service Fabric. And on top of that Service Fabric, in multiple geographical locations, Microsoft deploys its services, which are later deployed to different geographical regions. And those services cover various areas, for instance, compute, for instance, storage, networking, and so on. There's a ton of that. If you would like to start something new, you might want to look up what are the current offerings on Azure, and chances are that if you're looking for something very particular, it's already available via the Azure market. Also, you could say that this is a platform for running cloud services at hyperscale. And why am I saying that? Because this is a global, worldwide service. Each blue circle that you see is a production-ready region. And some of the regions are larger than others and host multiple data centers. For instance, multiple availability zones, like the pink dots in here. There are multiple regions under construction. So as you can see, Europe is going to become very, very important for Microsoft pretty soon. When I was starting to write this presentation, there were like 54 regions worldwide. So that's a lot. And the question is, where is that thing going? I mean, what are the plans for that? So Microsoft has been busy. This is a miniaturized equivalent of that container from the first image. And yes, it's running underwater. So this is actually a pretty smart move, because if you have a lake or a sea, then you could technically treat that as a place where you can exchange heat indefinitely. So that's cooling costs cut in half. So that's pretty smart. Let's see how that plays out. Okay, like I mentioned, Azure is a platform for running services. And one of those services, which I'll be discussing today, is called VSTS, or Visual Studio Team Services. Who is working with Visual Studio in any form? All right. Who has ever worked with TFS? Who regrets having worked with TFS? Okay, no regrets. So VSTS is the equivalent of TFS only as in the software as a service model. So it's hosted online, and if you set up a new account, then you end up with a subdomain of visualstudio.com. And the cool thing is that for starters and single developers and very, very small teams, it's practically free. So for free, you get project management, source control, continuous integration, continuous deployment, test management, a new Git package feed, and most importantly, an NPM package feed as well. So this is pretty cool because you have a private package feed for free. Okay, so that's enough about VSTS. Next up, like I mentioned, Azure is a platform to run services. And containers are the hot stuff today because if you have a container, then technically you have this golden image that you can lift and shift anywhere. So if it runs on your machine, then you can run it in Azure, you can run it in AWS, on DigitalOcean, or on an on-prem machine that has Docker Engine running. So this has become an important part of the landscape. And the question one might be asking themselves are, what are the dedicated web hosting services in Azure right now? So those are Azure App Services, but what are the container-enabled services in Azure? So those are Azure App Services, Azure Service Fabric, the scheduler which I've mentioned already. This is the thing on top of which Azure runs. Azure Container Service, Azure Kubernetes Service, and Azure Container Instances. So there's a lot to pick from. And last but not least, we have ACR, which is the Azure Container Registry. So we have a private registry for our containers. You don't have to upload them to hub.docker.com anymore and have them public. So it's available worldwide with some minor exceptions. Right, so what are we going to do next? Like I mentioned, we have VSTS, we have ACR. I have provisioned 2 app services. We'll take a short dive into the Azure portal. And we aren't going to do a lot of live coding, just enough to get the feel of what one needs to do to set up a project and have it built and deployed to Azure. So let's break some stuff. Right. So let me just start out by moving this here. When we sign into Azure, we first have to pick an account. So this can be either your private account or a company account. And based on the login, you end up at a different tenant in Azure. So like I mentioned, this is the new portal, which is based on the resource manager model. And the core of the resource manager model are the resource groups, which act as logical containers for resources. So if you have resources that are associated with a single service, it makes sense to put them in a single resource group. Or, for instance, if you have this service available in multiple regions, then it makes sense to have a single resource group per region. Okay, the other important aspect is that at this level, you can also govern some security. For instance, you can grant access to certain groups of people to resources in that group and prevent other groups of people from deleting that resource group. And for the purpose of today's demonstration, I have prepared 2 resource groups. One of them is NG Warsaw Classic, which is a classic Azure App Service web application running on top of an app service plan. This is actually the equivalent of a virtual machine with a web server. In the case when you're running on the Windows kernel, this would be the equivalent of IIS. So the cool thing is that the app service plan is your server farm, and if you have a single app service farm abstraction, then you can have multiple app services running on top of it. And back to the other resource group, which I have prepared is, I think this is it. Okay. So in here we have a somewhat different thing. So this one is actually an app service plan running on top of a Linux server. And the reason why I picked this is because, like I mentioned, the app services also support Docker. So, okay, next up, VSTS. This is my VSTS instance. Right now it's running under a preview UI that will be released to production soon. So it may break. If it becomes unusable, then we'll just switch back to the previous look and feel. And this is a project, so that's a unit of separation for projects within VSTS. And in that particular project, I have created a very, very simple web application, which you actually create with the Angular CLI. It has undergone some very, very minor modifications. So this thing is already under source control, and this is essentially the same thing that you get when you provision a new application with the CLI. So it's already under source control, but before we do that, let me show you the application on my drive. So it's here. So the question one should ask themselves is this buildable and shippable in a CI fashion out of the box? Yes, unless you want to enable tests. So as it turned out, when I was preparing this, I had to do some very minor modifications. For instance, this particular task acts as a watch, so it never terminates, and this will hang your build agent. So for that purpose, you need to introduce a separate npm task with this flag. So this will cause the application test to run once and then terminate, and that way you will unblock your build agent and make it available for other builds and releases. Another important thing is that what we have here, we can deliver in multiple ways. So first of all, we can do an ng build, and when we do, we will end up with a dist folder / application name folder and the bundled content inside. So we could take the raw content and ship it to application running in Azure, or we can zip it and do the same thing, or we can go for something completely different. And why not build the whole thing up as a container from the start? So what you have here is a multi-stage Docker file. So lately there has been a change in the Docker format, and it is now possible to use multiple from clauses. So you can see one in line 1 and in line 11. So what this does is, up until line 11, we're running on top of a node image, which I'm using for the purpose of just building the application. And finally, when the application is built, I'm provisioning an Nginx image, and I'm copying the artifacts which I have built in that previous image into the Nginx, and I'm good to go. So, and one other important thing, as you can see here, during the build process, I'm doing npm install. So I do not need to do that outside of my Docker context. Everything happens inside. Another important thing, the Docker ignore file. How many of you know how the Docker build process works? Okay, how many of you know what a Docker build context is? Okay, so let me explain what happens. We are in the root of our applications repository. If we type in docker build tag ng Warsaw, and now we need to provide a path for the Docker context. In that case, that will be the current directory, so I'll just use a dot. So this will start and build, and what happens is everything in that path of the Docker context is being copied into Docker client and is being built inside. If you have a repository which you have checked out and installed node modules to, then this potentially is one of the heaviest objects in the universe. So copying that into the container image is a waste of your time. So that's why it's worth to have that ignored and, well, do that stuff inside. Okay, looks like we have built our image. As we can see, Webpack has bundled it up. It's working, so let's try it. So I'll do Docker run port 8080 on the host, 80 in the container. Is it 80? I don't see. ng Warsaw. Oh, and maybe I'll also do interactive and remove it after I kill it. Okay, so you go here, you go here. Yay, it's working. You can see the web server spit out some logs. So we're good to go. Okay, so what would be the workflow in order to introduce a change that is immediately delivered into your hosting environment? This can be Azure, this can be anything. So let's assume that this is my primary tool to work with, and I have a work item that says remove the tour of heroes links and add a generic welcome message. All right, so this is work item number 163. So let me stop that. I'm gonna do git checkout, create a new branch, feature 163. So the product owner wants me to remove that stuff. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Okay, let's save our change. Now, important, add a hashtag and the number of the work item that you've been working with, because this will get immediately linked with the commit. And now we have pushed our changes to a brand new remote branch. Okay, so at this point, we should go here and open a pull request, because, yeah, actually that's even better to highlight. So this is our master branch, and it is not a very good practice to allow anyone to push code into the master branch directly in an uncontrolled manner. So it's always a good idea to have a pull request policy set up. So we have a minimum number of reviewers. This second setting is not something that you want to have enabled, but for the purpose of today's demonstration, I've enabled it. Also, check for linked work items, because you probably would like to know which work items were actually associated with the changes. Check for comment resolution, so make sure that if you spot something, you don't get ignored. And last but not least, set up a build to validate this. Okay, so let's open a pull request. Okay, you updated feature 163 a minute ago. Create a pull request. Links removed, welcome added. All right, let's create it. So as you can see, work items have been linked, all comments have been resolved, and the build has been queued. And nobody has approved this yet. Oh, and the build is already in progress. So let's see what happens. This is running on top of a so-called hosted agents. VSTS has different kinds of agents associated with them. Hosted agents are the agent images provided by Microsoft. And the cool thing is that those can be either macOS images, Linux images, or Windows images with all the stuff that you typically need to work with, which is pre-installed. You don't need to worry about it. Of course, you can have agents that you host on your own, on top of your own infrastructure, and then this becomes your concern. Today, there was an outage in Amsterdam when my infrastructure is hosted, so I do not guarantee that this will work, but at least it will be interesting to see it fail. There we go. So Okay, while this runs, let's see what's actually a part of that build. So this particular build definition has a single so-called task group, and a task group is a convenient way to group multiple tasks that you will be reusing in different build definitions. So if we click Manage Task Group, we end up here. So we do an npm install, npm lint, then I would do npm test and then aggregate the test results because VSTS can understand the JUnit format. However, today there was an outage and also spawning this task was problematic, so I've removed it from now. Okay, this build has passed. Let's get back to our pull request. So, okay, the build is passing, so let's review the code. So here's my change. Okay, this was removed, this was added. All right, I approve this. Oh, and let's set autocomplete. Okay, so we're done. So what happens now? That's the question. So as you can probably tell, there's a build definition which is monitoring the master branch for incoming changes. So whenever the master branch is updated, it fires up. So there are also multiple build definitions in here. What are the differences? So the definition with the PR suffix is used by me to validate the pull requests, and this is the actual build definition. The key difference is that, let me go here. We are using the same task group, but this definition actually emits artifacts. So this definition emits the contents of this /ng Warsaw. And this will be stored on top of Azure's infrastructure, and VSTS can reuse it for as many days as you specified. All right, so let's get back to the build. Let's see what's happening here. Okay, this is running. So the question is, what will happen next? Well, we have the artifacts, so there's probably a release definition somewhere. And release definition is something that's equivalent to a build. However, it typically gets triggered by updating an artifact feed. So a release definition can also have multiple artifacts. And the cool thing is that this now includes a pipeline editor. So we can edit the pipelines and model pretty convenient and interesting stuff. For instance, deploy stuff to the test environment, run UI tests, run integration tests, and once that is done, let's add this one. Okay, but I'd like this one to proceed when those two are finished. So how about we go here after environment. Okay, so that way I get to model pretty complex release pipelines. So this stuff gets pretty interesting. All right, but what's actually inside that environment? So it's a single task. As you have probably guessed, VSTS's integration with Azure is the best on the market, and there are a lot of tasks which are predefined and ready to use with with Azure's subscription of your choice. So you can pick an Azure subscription, find a resource which is of interest to you, and deploy that. And that works in case of web applications, Service Fabric applications. In case of containers, it's a little bit different. Okay, let's see what happens with the build right now. It should be over right now, but it isn't. Okay, this is another build. So this particular build is used only to build the Docker container image. So what this guy does is what I've done from the console. It builds the Docker image, prepares to tag it for the private Azure container registry, which I have running in Azure. And once the build is done, it will push the image. And once that image is updated, an app service which is running from the Docker container should pick up the change, and when that happens, it should update its image. So we'll see if it works. But also in the meanwhile, we are expecting to see a release happen. It's queued right now, so it's waiting until that other release finishes. So in order not to make this too long, if we go to ng Warsaw azurewebsites.net, this is the application which is running in the Docker container. However, the changes I have caused have not been applied yet. And if we go here, ng Warsaw Classic. So this is the other instance, which is running on top of the regular app service. And I'm hoping that this will get over pretty soon, because if not, this will become longer than I anticipated for no good reason. But while it's running, that's a perfect opportunity to shoot any questions that you might have. So let's make this interesting. Ask me anything.